If VR is going to be an established format for video gaming in the future, then that means established genres are going to need to be reinvented to fit it. Over the past 20 years, the seemingly permanent subgenre of tactical first-person shooters has changed bit by bit to finally get to this point where it's strapped into a plastic helmet using a giant plastic toy gun. The idea of shooting tactically rather than gratuitously probably originates in most people's minds with 1998's Delta Force or the original Rainbow Six from the same year, though if you go back a bit earlier in the 90s, you will see similar gameplay explored in all sorts of different fictional historical settings from different camera views. But back then in the 90s, the line between hardcore simulators and fun and games was much less blurry. The high price of PC gaming filtered in an older, niche upscale market of games with high difficulty, complicated interfaces, and complicated controls, often alleviated by the expectation that you'll be paying a premium for optional peripherals. The primary takeaway from that era, that you can still see happening today, is that price barriers can and do influence game designs. But games like Rainbow Six and Counter-Strike popped up to bridge the gap between hardcore sims and fun and games FPSing around the same time that those price barriers started to decay. 1999 was the year when computers and the internet had finally become mainstream, appearing in 1/3 of all American households. And that's a transitional era that I see as analogous to the current situation VR games are in. Expensive peripherals are influencing esoteric game designs, some of which we may never see again for a while as standards and tastes and marketing practices develop. On the PC side of the market, you're facing at least a $560 barrier to play a game like Onward, which heavily embraces its simulationist roots with things like complicated reloading procedures. Meanwhile, on the PlayStation side of things, a fully made-for-VR tactical simmy kind of FPS like Firewall Zero Hour is still going to control most like what you're probably used to. One stick controls movement, the other looks you left and right. To reload, you just press a single button. But the VR features unique to these games really drive the genre forwards, not just enhancing your immersion, but also giving you new moves with which to increase and exploit the high-tension and thrilling last-second saves of a tactical squad-based first-person shooter. And the beauty of Firewall, in particular, is that in this transition, it didn't just become more tense and scary to hold down corners and flash and clear rooms, it also became just plain more video game fun to run and gun with a giant shotgun you're gonna spray randomly in the bad guy's direction. Similar to how in Counter-Strike, you sure can use conga line teamwork tactics if you want, or you can bunny hop around the map with a deagle and still have your good fun regardless. And believe it or not, this feels like a major step, like a great blueprint for future games to follow, like the next step the genre can go up from Rainbow Six Siege. In fact, those two games almost feel like sisters of each other. But at least for now, Firewall is wearing its Rainbow Six Siege inspiration colorfully on its sleeve. The similarities are glaring, but even the devs will admit what they're doing.
And it's funny you say that because when I think about having those kind of moments in shooters, I always think back to early Rainbow Six.
Yeah!
Always.
Yeah.
And, you know, we look at Rainbow Six as a huge influence on this game because that's what we love to play.
Hold the phone. Rainbow Six Siege is, as of right now, my favorite multiplayer game ever. And apparently these guys like it too, but decided to go ahead and make a quick and dirty VR spin-off on it before Ubisoft could. So throughout every 4v4 match of Firewall Zero Hour, you have two teams of attackers and defenders who are rewarded with two currencies you spend upgrading named and stylized characters called, contractors, who use a balance of their special abilities and their customizable loadouts to breach a building and capture a laptop this time. Once a player dies, they control a series of security cameras they can use to feed information to their living teammates. I wonder where they got that idea. Unfortunately, Firewall does have a hell of a lot to go up against. Siege's cutting-edge destruction, graphics, and audio engines sure aren't here, and neither are the years of quality of life and interface improvements they've made since launch as well, but what Firewall does have are all those blue LEDs tracking the movement of your VR equipment. The boost in visibility from headset tracking feels and looks natural enough. There is a tactical advantage to looking one way while pointing your gun another way that shouldn't be too hard to explain, but the real game changer here is that controller tracking. What destruction is to Siege, controller tracking is to Firewall. This is a dynamic enough, unpredictable enough tool that encourages player creativity and ensures no two matches play the same, and it's a great way of solving the problem of campers exploiting their campsites. Whether it's with the DualShock 4 or the PS Aim controller, and I really hope if you pick this game up you have one of those aim controllers, you're gonna have to use your arm muscles to hold a virtual gun up to your face to aim with. You gotta wave it around corners and keep it hidden below cover, and sometimes even fitting yourself through doors can be a problem. If you want to be stealthy, you've got to collapse your arms down to a low profile, but whoops, your big long silencer might give you away. But those benefits and the detriments to moving a collidable object through these levels significantly changes the way these matches would have played out otherwise, largely thanks to the utter revolution that is blind firing. You can stick your hand in all sorts of holes and spray away in the general direction of bad guys, and doing that well is usually what determines who wins and loses matches. And since it takes you a good second and a half to raise your gun, line up your sights, and aim before shooting, suppressing fire is actually gonna work against you in this game. This is the first time I think I've really seen it work against human beings in a video game the same way it does against AI. You can pin enemies down and tell your friends to advance and flank like you're playing the FPS puzzles of Brothers in Arms, but against actual humans. Because of their VR arms, players pinned behind cover simply cannot return fire without exposing themselves for a good full second at least. They can still blind fire, but if your gun is pointed at their hiding spot, they will be, well, they're pinned down. But of course, these guns aren't 6-pound metal machines exploding in every player's hands. These are plastic toys that don't recoil in real life at all. So the beat-by-beat play is more like a game of paintball or airsoft. On the opposite end of that suppressing fire exchange, you can shrink yourself behind as much cover as possible while sticking as little amount of gun out as possible for blind fire that will cause close-range enemies approaching you to run the hell away. As exploitable as that controller tracking is, there is a cheeky sense of balance to it. There's a whole dimension to the dimensions of guns that was never a concern before. The small form factor of a sawn-off shotgun or an SMG or even a CQB variant of the longer-range rifles are now relevant factors to gameplay decisions you have to make when choosing and using those weapons. Smaller guns are better for close quarters after all, and you never really had to worry about why that was the case before. You never had to worry about how gosh darn big a silenced M16 actually is, and how much extra time it takes to work with it because of that. And then there's the factor of what both a cerebral and a sensory challenge the traditional Counter-Strike tactical shooter has always been. Listening for footsteps was always important, but now more so with 3D positional audio, in which the echoes of everyone's footsteps and gunfire are now able to draw a clearer pathway into your actual ears rather than your living room speakers. And when it comes to movement, this is the first time where I had to read up on the instructions for slicing the pie, which is apparently the real term they use for it in real combat training. And of course there's a WikiHow article on it. Slicing the pie means steadily holding and gaining little slivers of visibility as you move in a semicircular pie-sliced pattern over dangerous openings. Basically, the problems of worrying about my hands or shoulders sticking out of cover and actually being able to control those body parts means rethinking how cover in an FPS game works. The dynamics of Firewall are less about hugging yourself completely underneath cover than they are about shrinking the size of your silhouette far beyond cover. You want to keep your distance from cover, first of all, so that you can quickly escape if the enemy decides to rush out and overwhelm you, and secondly, and also what's exclusive to VR, is that it alleviates the worry of bumping your gun into solid objects on the way. These are all good tips for maintaining a front of sustained fire in the middle of a map, which just means it's time for someone on one of those two teams to sneak around and go for a flank. And those are the gloriously satisfying occasional flashes of a few seconds where traditional video game running and gunning still work. It's been said that you can judge the quality of any FPS by the feel of its shotgun. So here's a montage of Firewall's shotguns feeling really, really good.
I got a shotgun.
Chris Redfield.
I'll go in it.
Jill Valentine.
Oh my god, that was so cool. Xbox clip that.
Oh man, I tried to join him.
Got him.
Rebecca Chambers. Albert Wesker. Biohazard.
It's worth noting that while maintaining gun collision is a big aspect to Firewall Zero Hour, there's still very few ways for VR tech to convey it elegantly. The most feedback you get when your gun is blocked is a little audio ding, not even a rumble in the controller. Your real-life arms will often go where your virtual arms cannot, but even this has been turned into yet another VR-exclusive novelty. You can prop your gun onto scenery to stabilize it. And it's also worth noting that I never once felt a bit of motion sickness with this title. Of course, your mileage is going to vary depending on your body, but Firewall has smooth, slow, steady movement and perfectly flat floors. They have taken steps to ensure that a lot of stomach-dropping moments aren't going to happen. That being said, you've still got a generous amount of comfort options enabled by default. Snap turning and sprinting blinders were stuff I was able to comfortably turn off, but at this point, I'm willing to bet that your mileage is going to depend on how much time you've spent in VR previously. I'm starting to believe in the theory that, at least for those of us fortunate enough, you're going to gradually get your VR legs after enough exposure to it. Exhibit A, here is me trying to play Minecraft in VR 2 years ago.
Oh, puke bucket. Right.
Wait, this is a salad. But nowadays, for some reason, I can play hours of Minecraft in VR and be fine. But I gotta give even more praise to how much extra finesse those VR movements actually add. Diligent peeking and corner checking can reveal hidden enemies before you walk into their sightlines, which makes deaths feel fair and exploration feel empowering and rewarding. Though deaths can still come suddenly and unexpectedly, there's always a sense that the way to prevent them would have simply been a greater combination of both moving slower and thinking faster. But as genuinely cool and as genuinely fun as all this is, it doesn't polish over a kind of cheap feeling that, I just couldn't ignore once I noticed the guns have their real names on their 3D models but not in the menus. That cheap feeling is partially the fault of how much Siege influence is clearly visible, and how poorly a lot of it was actually used. There's no way that the contractors here, with their special abilities that function more like perks, are going to fill the hole of the strategic team composition role-playing that's going on in Siege. For starters, half of those abilities are likely going to be useless. Most of them are passive buffs to gameplay mechanics that aren't exactly much of a concern in the heat of a firefight, so expect to spend a lot of time playing as the lady who has decreased bullet damage. For seconds, the game has a straight upwards linear progression curve that's something I thought Game Design Talks 101 were telling everyone not to do back during, like, Battlefield Bad Company 2. Over the hours of chipping away at the unlockable meters to make a custom loadout as viable as the really quite limited 3 default loadouts, you might notice that, a lot of those unlockables are straight upgrades. Muzzle Brake 2, which requires more leveling, more purchasing, and more grinding than Muzzle Brake 1, is just plain better at breaking muzzles than Muzzle Brake 1, which is objectively worse than Muzzle Brake 3 and 4, and so on and so forth. A lot of the stuff you're unlocking are upgrades, not side grades, and that puts newer players at a disadvantage. The prices of guns are intimidatingly high, and I can't imagine why. VR games aren't traditionally suited for long play sessions for grinding out that incredibly slow progression system, unless the idea here is to actually break that trend and establish the first long-lasting multiplayer lifestyle VR shooter here, but that shouldn't disadvantage newer players for their first 40-something hours with the game. This is hopefully all likely to change with future patches. Hopefully for the better, since the developers have promised some extended support, but the most controversial aspect to that grind right now are easily the signal jammers. Those are unlocked at level 21, which can take anywhere from 20 to 40 hours depending on how many matches you win, which can of course be a factor entirely out of your own control. What these signal jammers do is prevent objective captures, and they can be hidden in awfully sneaky spots, at least one of which in a certain office complex is likely being considered a straight-up exploit right now. But this gadget provides a very necessary and gratifying dimension of extra gameplay to the end of matches. It can even be used to straight up move the defending team's front to entirely other separate rooms. But the big problem comes when attackers are up against a stack of them. During the final seconds of a match, and once everyone's dead, the match timer always jumps down to 60 seconds. Moving to the objective room, dodging the mines, and then finding 1 or 2 jammers is doable in 60 seconds, but finding 3 or 4 jammers is when that starts to become unmanageable. Nothing feels dumber than outsmarting, outshooting, and outmaneuvering a team that just is playing the game worse than your guys up until your team loses because despite doing everything else better, the 4 of you couldn't find the 4 of their jammers. By the way, did I mention the game uses a kind of peer-to-peer matchmaking system? The second dumbest feeling when playing this game comes during those unfortunate moments where you see host migration straight up kick everyone out of the match like you're playing Xbox Live circa 2004. This is also something I thought we'd move past, but also something the devs say they want to address. The rounds are also extremely short, very deliberately by design, but a 1-minute timer between switching sides, that is, it's only 1 minute even if there are 8 players in the lobby, often means that more time is going to be spent waiting in this menu rather than actually playing the matches. They could add a shooting gallery or something here, they could add multiple rounds per match, just something to make that waiting time easier. Menus are another matter entirely, because despite as much hard work as it is rendering fully detailed life-size virtual worlds, you'd never guess how complicated menus can be to make. Some needed quality-of-life features include the ability to determine a default loadout for attacker or defender on certain maps, or hell, even the ability to rename these to something other than loadout 1, 2, 3, or 4. Every time you swap sides, you're going to want to pick more defensive or offensive weapons or gadgets, and they're not exactly difficult decisions to make. All of which has me feeling that whatever does become the mainstay staple multiplayer VR shooter, the Counter-Strike of VR, might not actually be Firewall, but at least a game that looks, feels, and plays awfully close to Firewall. Their dev team has either developed something that'll inspire something else that'll one day become a real hot lifestyle game esports thing, or they are looking at the long and arduous road of patching it up and polishing it up to something that can one day become a real hot lifestyle game esports thing. It does remind me a lot of Rainbow Six Siege's early days, but at the same time, Siege's destruction provided a level of dynamism that made every match play out far differently than Firewalls do in the later hours. Procedural destruction means carving new routes and new sightlines out of the map that weren't exactly pre-cooked in by the developers, and Firewall's environments are totally static. All cover cannot be penetrated, so no matter how creative everyone gets with their communications and their VR movement, your routes through these maps are always going to be the same routes you've walked before. And I have to wonder if hardcore players are going to want to play hundreds of hours of this game once that repetition sets in. Until then, though, the fun is going to last for a long-ass time. That's supposed to be the most important thing, right? The game just being fun. And Firewall's shooting mechanics are super fun. Its movement mechanics are super fun. Communicating, even with random internet people in this game, is super fun. I mean, hell, even when you do lose against the defending team's signal jammers rather than the actual defenders, shooting and moving your way there is still gonna be good fun. I do worry about how long the game's community is going to stay hooked though, but until then, I'm never going to worry about whether or not I'll have a good time once the lobby fills up and the match actually gets going.
Actual belief. Who remaining?